that in 1907, Anna Jarvis from Philadelphia persuaded her home church in Grafton, West Virginia to set aside the anniversary of her mother's death as a special day to honor mothers, and it was the second Sunday in May. And eventually it just spread all over the country, and many others, churches began to set aside the second Sunday in May for a special day to honor mothers. And eventually, in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson declared the second Sunday in May as a national holiday to honor mothers. And so here we are. And boy, do they ever deserve to be honored, for sure. And we appreciate you all so much. Mothers are among the most important people on earth. Maybe the most important people on earth, really. But I do not speak only of biological mothers. Many people have been mothered by a surrogate mother. Adopted mothers, foster mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, aunts, friends of the family, church mothers, and in some cases a caring day caregiver. And the list could go on of people who are mothering children in various ways, and so we honor all of them as well. So mothers certainly deserve to be honored. They're primarily responsible for us during our most vulnerable times of life, when we're most dependent and vulnerable, and so they give of themselves and lay down their lives for their children. I like to share pretty much every year this little quip about a child in regard to mothers. It goes like this. It comes from Kids of the Kingdom. 4-year-old Emily accompanied her mother into a public restroom equipped with handicap facilities. "What are the bars for?" she asked. "Well, they're for big people to hold on to." And her mother explained about that, and Emily thought for a moment and squeezed her mother's hand and said, "Little girls don't need bars because they have mommies to hold on to." And I like that, how true that is. There's a church sign that said, "If evolution is true, how come mothers still have only 2 hands?" So, as I often do on Mother's Day, I like to take a woman from the Bible and talk about her, a mother who is very special and gives us a great lesson on Mother's Day. The particular mother I'm going to speak about today was used by God to move people into a place who would become a part of the lineage of King David and of Jesus. And this is going to be taken from the book of Ruth, if you want to turn your Bibles there. This woman has not made any headlines, but provides to us a model of a woman of faith. She wasn't a perfect woman, but she understood that faith in God was the best route to take in life. But anyways, her name was Naomi, a Judean from Bethlehem, and she appears in the book of Ruth as a principal character, and her role was that of a mother-in-law who cared very deeply for her daughter-in-law, a foreigner, a Moabite. So let's read the first part of the story, beginning at Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Epaphrodites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The names of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Now, let's look back for a moment and just reflect on what's happened here. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons left their home in Bethlehem, Judah, which was the promised land, right? A land of promise that God had given them. They left there because of economic necessity, they felt anyways. There was a great famine in the land. And they settled for 10 years in Moab, and just east of the Dead Sea. And it was there that the 2 sons married Moabite women named Orpah and Ruth. And at the end of 10 years, Elimelech and his 2 sons had died, leaving 3 widows behind. Now, one thing we could see here is that even though this little family lived in the land of promise, that they were not exempted from trials and difficulties. And Elimelech's choice to leave and go live in Moab, a pagan land where other gods were worshipped, is interesting. Nowhere are we told that God actually spoke to them, the Lord spoke to them and said, leave the land of promise and go to Moab where people worship other gods. You don't think God's going to tell anybody that, do you? And so they went anyways to the land of Moab, and there was a fertile plain there just east of the Dead Sea. And so that became a place where they felt like they could find provision. Now, when Abram was faced with a great famine in the land of promise as well, he too fled. He fled to Egypt. But later he deeply regretted it. And you can find the story about this in Genesis chapter 12. No doubt, though, that God would have provided in both cases had they remained. Now, you know, as followers of Jesus, neither are we exempt from difficulty at times. We have trials as Christians. Jesus even told his followers one day, he said, in this world you will have tribulation. And that word tribulation simply means that times of stress, that you will have times of stress and difficulty. And so, sometimes, like Elimelech and Abram, we will be tempted to see an answer to our difficulty outside of faith in God's provision. The result of Elimelech moving his family to Moab was that his sons both married Moabite women who were idol worshipers. And for the people of Israel to die and be buried in a foreign land was considered a tragedy. But this is exactly what happened to this man and his two sons. But from here on out, a plan of redemption began to unfold. That is the way God operates. Whenever God's children make wrong choices or unwise choices outside of His will, what happens? Well, God immediately begins to put into effect a plan of redemption. And that's what He has done really for all of mankind, and we'll see that later on. But, think about that. Have any of us made wrong choices outside of God's wise counsel? Of course we have. And I've done that a few times, and I've lived to regret it each and every time because there were consequences that I didn't care much for. And so, listen, the Lord will redeem us from those messes still because of His love for us. And when, that promise in Scripture in Romans chapter 8, for we know that God works with all things together for good for those who love Him or are called according to His purpose. All things involve as well our wrong choices. He works with our wrong choices. He works with our mistakes, our errors in judgment, about things and how we step outside of His will sometimes. And yet He still works with those things for our good. And we're going to see that this is something that God did with Naomi. In verse 6, we read on. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited His people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, Surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them until they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her, and she said, Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Now, Naomi heard that the Lord was blessing in Judah. And with prosperity again. So she decided that she was going to go home. And we can almost hear her thinking, we should have stayed in the land that the Lord had given us, that the land of promise all along, and trusted in God's provision. Why didn't we do that? But they made that choice, her husband made that choice to take them to the land of Moab. But I can just see, that she's thinking, we should have gone home a long time ago. And so, there's a heartbreak there because of it taking so long to go home. Too often, when people suffer loss and difficulty, their hearts turn hard toward the Lord. After experiencing some kind of heartbreak. But Naomi looked to her Lord for help. And her example is important to us. Loss is inevitable, but it is far better to lean on the Lord than it is to push him away. That's when we need to lean on him all the more, is when we're going through loss and heartbreak. Psalm 94:19 says, "In the multitude of my anxieties within me, your comforts delight my soul." The Lord is our comforter. My own Grandma Neal was an example of this. She lost 2 sons as a young mother. She wore that loss in the lines on her face and the pain in her eyes. My family, my mother inherited my Uncle Kenneth, who had died at the age of 10. She inherited his little toy gas station, So guess what? She said, "Jerry, I'm going to go ahead and give this to you." And so I have that in my possession now. And I don't know, it's about 70 years old or something like that now. So it's old. But, there was a big loss for my grandmother. Then my Uncle Clarence also died at the age of 7. And she wore that loss. And yet Grandma had a deep, abiding faith in the Lord. And she passed that on to her children and her grandchildren. Second, it is clear that Naomi had faith that her place at home in Judah was still there for her, that she would have a secure place there, and she was welcome to go back home. What a beautiful picture of the grace of God that is, isn't it? That no matter how far we have moved away from the Lord, he will welcome us back home again to be with him. Third, Naomi was an example of other-centeredness. As Orpah's and Ruth's surrogate mother, she blessed them. She was a mother-in-law who blessed her daughters-in-law. And it's special to receive a mother's blessing. Let's read that again. She said, "The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest." Now, I'm thinking of how cool it would be if every mother, as their children, for instance, when they're small and getting ready to go to school, would bless their children, and say, "May the Lord be with you and keep you in his care. May the Lord be with you as you go to class, as you take tests, whatever you do today, may the Lord be with you and keep you in his care." And so giving a blessing to a child is very special. Vicki and I had our grandchildren with us for 8 days recently. And so I prayed with them each day or every night, and, I gave them a blessing. And you know what? Their faces would just light up when I gave them that blessing. And mothers, I'm going to tell you, start blessing your children. Pronounce a blessing. You don't have to be a minister to give a blessing, I think it's something that you can do quite well. I'm going to give one at the end of this service, But you can do it as well. May the Lord keep you and bless you. May his face shine upon you. May his love be poured out upon you. May you know how much God loves you. Speak those kinds of things to your children. Give them a blessing. Naomi advised her daughters-in-law that she freed them to make their own decisions and bless them. And it was at this point that Naomi truly became a surrogate mother. She was more than just a mother-in-law. She became a mother to these girls. And great mothers advise their children of the facts of life, but know that they cannot control the future for their children as they grow into adulthood. You can't control it. Your children are going to make their own choices in life. And so great mothers will advise their children, but also understand that they are free to go ahead and choose their own way. If Orpah and Ruth went back home, they were more assured of a husband. If they went with Naomi, there were no such assurances to be made for them, and except by the grace of God. Naomi was thinking about the custom in those days that if a woman were widowed without children, she would marry a brother of her husband. And there were no brothers. And Naomi had clearly stated that to them. There's no other brothers coming along to take you as their wife, And so you've got to look somewhere else for a husband. So Orpah and Ruth, the widowed daughters-in-law, decided to go with Naomi. But Naomi believed she should not stand in the way of them returning to their Moabite mothers' houses and taking new husbands from among their own people. Well, Orpah decided to turn back and go to the home of her youth and to her Moabite gods. But Ruth wanted to stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and place trust in Naomi's God. And that was really the turning point. That was the pivotal thing, was who are you going to put faith in, the gods of Moab or the God of Naomi? And Ruth made the right choice. She chose to put her faith in God Jehovah. Naomi's faith impacted Ruth, who began to see her as a spiritual mentor. The truth is that God chose Naomi to become a true mother to Ruth, who would play a role in God's redemptive plan for mankind. Perhaps someone here has become a spiritual mother in some child's life. If so, think of that as a calling from God to impact him or her according to faith. I never will forget, I went to a luncheon where the evangelist James Robinson was speaking. And he told a story that I didn't know this about him, but he told this story of how he was unwanted by his mother when she was pregnant with him. He was unwanted by her, and she began to make plans to get an abortion. But instead, she gave him away. Well, what a sad story that is. But listen what happened. James Robinson was given to a godly woman to raise as if he were her own. And it was her example that James followed as she had followed the Lord. And then the Lord called him into an amazing ministry as a minister of the gospel. And so what impact did that godly woman have on this man's life as he grew up? Powerful. Naomi's kindness and concern toward her daughter-in-law had far-reaching positive effects. You never know how much you're touching a child with the love of God is going to affect their life in a powerful way. You never know how touching one person with kindness can impact the bigger picture that goes on as they begin to develop into adulthood. And a mother's faith can have great influence in the lives of her children. Paul wrote to his young protege, Timothy, about this very thing. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 4 says, "Greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I may be filled with joy when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also." So he's saying to Timothy, you know what? You got two women in your life that have had an amazing effect upon you. And they have had a powerful spiritual impact in your life. And, don't ever diminish, moms, don't ever diminish what you're doing with your children. It's not as important as what some preacher is doing or someone else. You are the most powerful voice in your children's life when they are little, especially, and they need to hear, about the spiritual things of God from all of those who have that kind of influence in their lives. So it's clear that Paul credited the great faith of Timothy's mother and grandmother as playing a major role in his spiritual journey of faith. And for me, this same tribute would apply to my grandmother, Etta Neal, and to my mother, Betty. Throughout my history with them, they've demonstrated an unwavering, genuine faith. And I'm sorry, guys, you've heard me brag about my mom before, but I'm going to do it again. Okay, is that all right? All right, okay. Some of you know her. Well, I have deep respect for her and how she's managed her life through many trials and difficulties. She's been through a lot, I can tell you. But she maintained a deep faith in God through everything, even a sense of optimism about life. And her example has reminded me of God's faithfulness during difficult times in my life. In other words, I've been able to say, look what my mother did when she was under fire, when she was in great trials, when she was in great difficulty. She stayed the course. She remained true to the Lord. And she received His strength and His help through all of that. And so I've been able to say that too. Now I'm going to be like her. Now I'm like her in a lot of other ways too. I look a little bit like her. I have her personality. She's a little bossy at times, And when she bosses me, I pay attention and I do whatever she wants. One time I was driving her home to Missouri, and she said, "We need to stop here and eat at this place." And she named the place, and I knew it was a different exit. She said, it's this exit now. Do you turn here? What did I do? I turned there, even though I knew that it was the next exit up. I wasn't going to argue with her, you know. So we turned and we tried to find the place to eat, and it wasn't there. She says, well, I guess I'm wrong about that. And I said, well, we'll keep going. We'll find it. I knew exactly where it was, you know. So we went to the next exit. We pulled off, and there it was. She said, well, I guess it's this exit instead of the other one. I thought sure it was the other one, you know. My wife thinks I'll do the same thing to her, you know, at times. And I do. Going back to this moving story about a mother-in-law named Naomi, we see that Ruth loved her like she was her own mother. So she refused to turn back. Listen to this, how it goes. But Ruth said, verse 16, but Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. And the mark of a godly woman is that she is a spiritual mentor in her children's lives. It's clear that though Orpah returned to her Moabite home and her Moabite gods, Ruth had become a woman of faith in Naomi's Lord. Your God shall be my God, she said. She said, your God is my God, and spoke of her devotion to the Lord of Naomi. At that point, Naomi stopped exhorting Ruth to go back. She knew that it was her faith that was motivating her now, and nothing else. It wasn't her vision of having another husband. It was her vision of the Lord. She knew that she could trust in God, the God of Naomi. And so she made that choice. And Naomi says, I'm not going to argue with that. You come on with me. So in verse 19, we read on. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? But she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Now Naomi returned home to Bethlehem, and everyone was excited to see her. In a sense, she had been lost, and now she's been found. And this is reflective of the story that Jesus told. You remember that Jesus told of the lost sheep that had been found, and the whole village rejoiced with the shepherd who found that lost sheep. The whole village gathered around and rejoiced at the finding of that sheep and the return to the flock. Now, it's obvious that Naomi had deep regrets about having left her home for 10 years. And the name Naomi means pleasantness. So she wasn't feeling all that pleasant as yet. She would later on. But she said she left full but returned empty, and they should call her Mara, meaning bitterness, or more so, meaning for her heavy-heartedness. She was heavy-hearted. Naomi is filled with both regret at having left her home and heavy-heartedness over the loss of her husband and her two sons. But Naomi's bitterness and brokenness of heart did not remain. The rest of the story is a story of redemption. Let's begin in chapter 2, verse 1. There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, and of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor. She said to her, go, my daughter. Then she left and went and gleaned in the field. Notice that she called her daughter. Now, not daughter, go my daughter-in-law. No, that in-law thing had dropped off. Go my daughter. Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, "It is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." So she fell on her face, bowed to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" And Boaz answered and said to her, "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." So as Ruth's surrogate mother, her spiritual mother, Naomi invested her whole energy in mentoring her adopted daughter, Ruth. Naomi is moving into sort of a matchmaking role at this point, and between Ruth and Boaz, who was Naomi's kinsman and was eligible because of that to be Ruth's husband. We do not have time to follow how all this happened this morning, but go ahead sometime today and read the full story. But indeed, Boaz and Ruth eventually married. Now, when Naomi returned home, a broken woman, the Lord had a plan of redemption that would make her heart glad again. Not only would Naomi and Ruth experience God's grace of redemption, but in the plan of God, Ruth, the widowed Moabite woman, would be the great-great-grandmother of King David. And she would also be in the lineage of Jesus as well. This foreign woman who came from a home that worshiped idols and other gods. God redeemed her and made her a part of a very special, wonderful plan. And so that's a wonderful thing. What does this mean to us? Well, when we lose our way from the family of God, though there may be loss and bitterness, God is merciful and gracious, always calling us home where He has a plan of redemption in place for us to return to His provision. There was another man who was really more eligible to be Ruth's husband and to redeem the land that had belonged to Elimelech, Naomi's husband. And he was the only thing that was standing between Ruth and Boaz becoming husband and wife. But Boaz bought the right of redemption from that man so he could lawfully inherit the land and Ruth could become his bride. In this, there's a beautiful symbolism of the redemption that has come to us through Christ. Boaz is a type for Christ, who purchased our redemption so that we could be His bride. What was standing in the way of our redemption and inheritance through Christ? Well, it was the condemnation of the law because of our sin. And so this man who stood between Ruth and Boaz, he was a type for the law, who condemned sin, but could not save us from sin. But Jesus purchased our redemption by taking the condemnation of our sin upon Himself when He died on the cross as the Lamb of God. So now we belong to Him as the bride of Christ. The story of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz is a beautiful, beautiful love story. Naomi loved her widowed daughter-in-law as her surrogate mother. But Ruth loved Naomi as her adopted mother. Naomi pointed Ruth to the kinsman who would purchase their redemption. Boaz loved Ruth so much that he did what she could not do. He purchased her inheritance for her, and she became his bride. As for our Mother's Day application, Naomi is a great example of someone who was a godly mother, but became a spiritual mother as well. You know, she's also an example of someone who had made mistakes as a mother. And yet, those mistakes were redeemed. And how beautiful that is as well. She exemplifies the mother who points her children to Christ. She pointed Ruth to Boaz. And so a mom today in the body of Christ, one of her primary responsibilities is to point her children to Jesus, point her children to Christ, of whom Boaz is a type. There are many beautiful, godly women who are part of this fellowship, and for each and every one, we are thankful. Naomi reminds us that mothering ways are not always needed by someone. There are people around us whose mothers are or were not spiritually minded women of faith. There are lots of opportunities to mentor those who need the example of a woman of faith, because like I said, there are people who were not raised by a woman of faith. And maybe there's been a lot of wounding and things that have gone on in that person's life because of it. But then there's Naomi, who's a type for the mom, you see, who steps in as a surrogate mother, a spiritual mentor, who is able to lead a child, a grown child perhaps even, that has had a bad experience with a mother, to lead them in mothering as a special spiritual mother in that person's life. So there are opportunities to minister to the needs of others and experience the reward of watching some younger person like Ruth grow into the plan and blessing of God. So we are so thankful for all the Naomis in our lives. You know, even if you're living a long ways from your mother, you know, when Vicki and I were young ministers, I was a young minister, and I remember when we moved to Rockingham, North Carolina, and Vicki's parents lived in Florida, mine in Missouri, and you know, we made the annual trip to both places. But what happened in between? And we loved being mothered, you know. And in Rockingham, North Carolina, there was this woman there named Elizabeth Thrower. Never forget her. And, you know, she took us under her wing. She fed us on Sundays, every Sunday after church, you know, and we loved it. And, you know, she babysat our Joel when he was a little baby, you know, and she made him a nice little quilt, you know, that he slept with until he was full grown almost, you know. And, you know, just a wonderful surrogate mother, spiritual mother in our lives. I'll never forget her. And you know, the interesting thing about that is one of Vicki's best friends today is Elizabeth Thrower's daughter, whom we did not know at that time. But she lived in Nashville, still does, and we dropped Elizabeth off at her house one day to visit while we were going to Missouri, right? And so then we would pick her up on the way back, take her back to Rockingham. But over time, when we moved to this area, over time, Vicki and Elizabeth Thrower's daughter, you know, became best of friends. And that friendship has lasted a long time, like 35 years, you know. They are sisters in a lot of ways. So anyways, just throw that story out there for you. So, you know, maybe you think, well, my only responsibility, the only thing I need to be concerned about is my biological children. But there are adult children, there are younger people who need you. And they need your spiritual guidance. They need your shelter from the storm. They need you to reach out to them with the love and kindness like of a Naomi. We are thankful for the Naomis in our lives, aren't we? You know, that have come our way. So we're going to close our service today by giving thanks for the women who are special to us. And again, I do not want to just include only natural mothers, but those who have been surrogate mothers to someone. There are spiritual mothers who are used by the Lord to impact the lives of those who did not have that as a heritage. There have been wonderful surrogate mothers who never had a child of her own, but they had become a mother to other children in a very special way. Like Naomi and Ruth, those people who have come under that godly influence know how special that is.